I'm joining you today from the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. Toronto is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, and we are grateful for the opportunity to gather and learn here today. Over the course of the next couple of hours, we'll talk about the future of the automotive industry for automakers and consumers. If you're joining us in person today, I would like to invite you to stay for some refreshments and networking after the discussions. I'm pleased to be co-moderating today with Patrina Gentili, an automotive journalist and frequent contributor to Globe Drive. I'd also like to take this moment to thank our presenting sponsor, Toyota. Before we start our first discussion, join me in welcoming Andrew Gordon, General Counsel and Corporate Secretary of Toyota Canada, to make some opening remarks.
Thanks very much. Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us today. I think we can probably all agree there's never been a more exciting time or interesting time to be in the automotive industry. Challenging for sure, with no shortage of change, disruption, and a range of issues to tackle. But also exciting, with new technologies and new designs being revealed on what seems to be a weekly basis. Today, we'll be discussing the future of automotive through an electrification lens, which is appropriate because it addresses climate change, the most important challenge facing our society. Toyota's goal has always been to reduce overall emissions as much as possible, as quickly as possible. And, starting with the advent of hybrids, we've been leading in this space for over 25 years. Of course, the market for electrified vehicles in Canada today is in flux. With recent changes to incentives, battery electric vehicles have, in many cases, become less affordable for most Canadians. For this reason, providing consumers with a range of electrified powertrain options to choose from, including battery electric, plug-in hybrid, and whatever other new technologies emerge, is more important now than it's ever been. As an automaker, staying flexible allows us to quickly respond to changing consumer demands. Providing Canadians with a choice of electrified powertrain technologies and a wide range of vehicle types makes it easier for drivers to choose the electrified vehicle that best fits their needs, lifestyles, and budgets. And this is important because it means more consumers will choose to buy an electrified vehicle, putting more carbon-reducing vehicles into more driveways and reducing emissions now more than ever. It's the right thing to do for Canadian drivers, and it's the right thing to do for the planet. But the best is yet to come. Future electrified powertrains and innovations like solid-state batteries, hydrogen combustion engines, and more are right around the corner. Automakers, very much including Toyota, are investing billions of dollars in research and development in this space, and many are already building battery production facilities right here in North America. For example, and to show how serious Toyota is about embracing electrification, we're currently finishing construction of a $14 billion battery plant in Liberty, North Carolina. This will be Toyota's first in-house battery factory outside of Japan and will produce batteries for hybrid, plug-in hybrid, and battery electric vehicles. The plant is well underway and is scheduled to deliver its first batteries a few weeks from now in April. Within the next decade, more choice, longer range, faster charging, and lower cost will make zero-emission vehicles a more attractive and affordable option for all Canadian drivers. The topics we'll be discussing today are critical to the future of our industry. We're proud to support this important dialogue, and we thank the Globe and Mail for facilitating today's forum. Thank you very much. Hope you enjoy the day.
Thank you, Andrew. All right, let's begin our first panel on the EV outlook. And we have a great list of guests, so let's introduce them. First, to my immediate right, is Kara Clairman, President and CEO of Plug and Drive. And next to her, we have Diego Bitar, the inaugural Burson Foster North America Scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And on the far, your far left, we have Jason Clifton, consulting partner at EY Canada. All right, Kara, I want to start with you. What are you seeing when it comes to EV demand in Canada?
Well, actually, EV demand is stronger than it's ever been, and there's a number of reasons why that might be, but I do want to say that in 2024, demand was much higher than predicted, and in fact, much higher than maybe some news articles might suggest. We finished the year very strong, and of course, the first quarter of this year is going to be incredibly strong, partially because of the loss of the rebates, and so there was a race to grab it while they could. And there were a lot of people who, I think, bought an EV in January because that was the last chance for rebates. So I think we're going to see very positive numbers in January.
And of course, we're in February now.
Yes.
So, and the ISEV rebate has ended.
Right.
And automakers are, I guess, some automakers said they would not just honor them, but would give the $5,000 back to the consumer.
Yes.
But that was only for a few weeks.
Right.
So what do you see now that the rebates have ended?
Well, I think to be fair, I think we will see a bit of a drop. I don't think it will. I see it more as a bump in the road than sort of a desperate situation. I think it will creep up again, just like what we saw in Ontario when we lost the Ontario rebate. And then we did see demand, sort of pick up again over time. And remember, there are a number of provinces of Canada that still have rebates and ZEV mandates. And if the federal government does carry through with the ZEV mandate, I'm optimistic that we'll see decent demand over 2025.
Jason, did you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I can jump in as well. So I think for us, we just finished our fifth mobility consumer index, and would support exactly that. The intent of people to buy vehicles generally has increased by sort of 6%. And then on top of that, when you actually look at electric vehicles, the makeup of that continues to increase over time. I would say, and I would agree, there's no turning back now. If you look at the tipping point of where we are as society and where we are, to me, this is just the continuation of now what's been put in place and to progress through that. Yeah.
Diego?
I would have to disagree.
Yes.
No, I think at least EV consumption in Canada has peaked. Some of the figures that you were mentioning, I think they're completely right, but giving other structural roadblocks like prices, we don't have those programs anymore, but we still have mandates, we have deficient infrastructure. There's a lot of uncertainty regarding tariffs and what's going to happen to the EV environment in the next few years, not only here, but also in the US. So I think EV production and consumption is going to reach a hibernation period, at least for 2-4 years, depending on how the midterms go in the US and what ends up happening here. But hopefully after that period, production and consumption will pick up, but it's going to be very difficult given that we have here deficient infrastructure. I was just looking at the numbers. Canada built 6,000 public charging stations last year. We only have 30,000. If we wanted to get rid of those scale problems that we have here about range anxiety, we would have to be building 30,000 public charging stations every year. That's not something that's happening. And EVs are at the top of an already pricey market, and without federal help, it's going to be very difficult for that to pick up.
Kara, when I wanted to come back to you and ask.
Are you going to give me a chance to disagree?
Sure, yeah, go for it.
Okay, so look, I think the concern about public infrastructure is way overblown. Yes, we need more charging. I'm not suggesting we don't, but if you look at the stats, 80% of people who buy EVs charge at home. And so for the bulk of people, it's a non-issue. Sure, there are people that need public charging, like for example, if you live in a multi-unit residential, so perhaps in the bigger cities. But for people who live, suburban, even rural, this is just a non-issue for them. They charge at home, they commute, they charge at home. And so I do think that to suggest that the lack of infrastructure actually will cause demand to drop, I don't see that. I think actually when people understand how much they drive relative to the amount of range the car has. So again, Stats Can will tell you 80% of Canadians drive 50 kilometers or less a day. So it's really just not as big of an issue as people make it out to be.
So when you talk to drivers, when they come in and they have questions about purchasing their first EV, what are their biggest concerns?
Number one, still cost. They see that sticker price, and there's nothing you can really do to take away that sting, because it is a little bit more than a gas car.
Losing the rebate makes that even harder.
Well, and losing the rebate affects it. Now, what we try to show people is actually you have to look at your cost over time, or your total cost of ownership, not the cost of the vehicle. So if you do your total cost of ownership, you'll see owning an EV, even without rebates, is much more affordable than a gas car, but you have to show people that math. And people don't usually do math when they go buy a car. So this is something we've had to explain to a lot of people. So for example, if you pay $1.50 a liter for gas, I'm paying 28 cents. And then if I go on the ultra low, I'm paying 14 cents a liter equivalent. I mean, you just can't almost believe how cheap it is. So you can get that payback very quickly. And we need to be able to show Canadians that this is actually a way to save money.
It's a tough road to climb. We did an article that was about EV pricing, but we interviewed a professor of marketing. He was basically saying you can show somebody one T-shirt that costs $100, but it'll last you forever, or one that costs like $20, but you're gonna have to replace it every year. People are always gonna buy the $20 shirt. Getting over that initial hurdle is
it's
a
a difficult
big
problem.
challenge.
So we're trying one driver at a time to explain this to people. And I do think the message is getting through, and it just takes time. And also we have studies that show really they need one test drive, and that's all they need to be convinced. But without that, they tend not to be convinced.
Jason?
Yeah, no, I mean, I suppose to me as well, it's if you look at kind of people who already own EVs and you ask them again if they would own an EV again, the answer is unequivocally yes. There's a huge amount of technology advancement that has come into these vehicles. The cost on the whole, so just give you some numbers, by the time you look at total cost of ownership on an EV on average, you can save somewhere in the range of about $20,000 on the life of a car. So if you sort of procure, so back to your $120 piece, okay? And then I think, when you compare and contrast cents, 3 cents per kilometer EV compared to probably in the range of about 17 to 18 cents per kilometer for internal combustion. That's a 6 times difference, right? So by the time you kind of price this out, and you're right, from an infrastructure perspective, that hurdle is still present. We've seen that in our studies as well. But I think on the average, like you said, 50 to 80 kilometers on a drive, most people are going to wake up in the morning with their cars charged outside of obviously the MURBs and the public. And that's a huge difference. Like if you guys start to think about the cultural and societal shift, not needing to go back to a gas station, wake up in the morning, it's all there. And for the majority of where it's going to take us, I think EVs are going to be here to stay for sure.
Not going to a gas station is my husband's favorite part of owning an EV.
Yeah.
And not to be a contrarian here, I think price can be addressed, infrastructure can also be taken care of, but something that we cannot control are tariffs and what's happening with our neighbor in the south. This approach of a high fence, small yard approach it's not good for Canadian consumers. We have Canadian tariffs on Chinese EVs, potentially Canadian tariffs on US EVs. Minister Freeland was floating the idea of slapping a tariff on Tesla, for example. And then potentially the end of the Inflation Reduction Act and all those tax credits that had it there for EV production in the region. So if you don't address, it's impossible to address that. And until we are able to get past that, it's going to be very difficult. And business uncertainty is something that's going to, it's a dark cloud in the horizon that we're not going to get rid of, at least in the next 2 years.
I do want to get to the industry side of it in a little bit, but that sort of lends into the next thing I wanted to talk about, which is right now the average price of an EV in Canada is about $75,000. And we look across the Pacific Ocean, there are much cheaper EVs in China, but we have a very high tariff on them here. Mm-hmm. It seems to me most consumers are not going to pay $75,000 for a new EV. But does that mean more Chinese EVs are going to be coming into the Canadian market? Do you think the tariffs need to be higher? Should we support the Canadian industry more? I don't know. Jason, let's start with you.
Yeah, so I think just first of all on the parity or price parity between internal and EV, so folks, just over time we're seeing that dropping, okay, and that would just be a natural advancement of technology. You mentioned solid-state batteries. Technology is making a huge difference. When we hit solid-state battery, in terms of these vehicles, range is not going to be an issue by any stretch of the imagination. It's going to save a whole lot. I think just what ends up happening is with the tariffs from China and how they're going to be thinking about bringing those vehicles in relative to as well then Trump and where we are, it is going to have an interplay on people, volume, supply chain, and a couple of things to that level. Trump is only going to be around for, say, the next 4 years. That is a big difference in terms of where we're seeing the trajectory of vehicles still going, even with those costs on top of it. Most vehicles are coming in now from an EV perspective. The MSRP, if you look at a $40,000 to $50,000 car, ranges in the range of about 400 to 500 kilometers. So what's happening is we're getting more vehicles on market with more choice. At the end of the day, that's going to obviously impact. From a China perspective, we'll have to see how this tariff war plays out, I think, between Canada and the US and how the US impacts China. I don't actually have a good answer for that one outside of, I think China's actually watching and getting ready to kind of see where we're going. They use a huge amount of steel as well in their production, so they can keep driving that cost of those EVs down, actually to the point that when some of those tariffs come in relative to other vehicles, the costs, for an end user could allow us to buy some of those vehicles. I don't know, folks.
Yeah, no, I mean, they can still depreciate their currency and get past some of those tariffs. And to the US, I would say be careful what you wish for, because if you keep pushing your top trading partners, I mean, in Mexico, I started seeing those voices a long time ago. Like, hey, if the US is imposing tariffs on us, like, why should we rely so much on them? We should explore other markets, and China is always the first option. But this is the first, since the two Michael situation, this is the very first time that I'm starting looking at people commenting, like maybe rethinking like the whole approach between Canada and the US. And then, this is very new, and I wouldn't expect that to happen until very recently. So we'll have to wait and see.
Kara?
Yeah, for sure. I agree. I think even, as Jason said, even if 100% tariff on the Chinese vehicles, I think they'll still be quite affordable. So if they come, I think, it will give Canadians an option. And then what I would say to folks who are hesitant because they're waiting or worrying about tariffs, etc., used. There are a lot of used EVs available, and that there's tons available on the used market. So why not, encourage used in the sort of short to medium term until we kind of have more clarity?
The big question I keep coming back to on the issue of Chinese EVs is basically, like, will the federal government face a choice between having more Canadians drive EVs or protecting our homegrown auto industry? Jason, let's start with you.
Yeah, so I think, and if you've seen Doug and if you've seen everything else in the media right now, I think our first priority is Canada first, local protection, and making sure. We still have to run an economy, we still have to get this all moving forward. And I also think just with all the investments that we're seeing present within Canada, we have to make good on all of that. So I think my perspective would be is we'll start to see a continued, stay around that mandate. And then I think from a China perspective, should we see other issues with the US that are not working in terms of the tariff wars, there's other levers for us to pull and push. And I think we've got Europe, we've got, if you talk about Mexico, even just our ability to go and do Canada-Mexico trade. Like, there are so many other options out there. I think right now the big shiny thing, unfortunately, is where we are with the US. So until that subsides, I think we're still going to be Canada first all the way through.
Diego?
Touching on that last point, I think the whole Mexico-Canada axis has been unused, underutilized, and that's something that we have to talk more about. It's incredible that 82% of the Mexico's exports go to the US and only 3% go to Canada. And it's exactly the same numbers from the Canadian perspective. And there are many things that Mexico buys from the US that could get from Canada. And that's something that has to be explored more. Unfortunately, I don't think the political angle is set for it. Given what some of the premiers have been saying about Mexico, I spoke with some people from the Secretary of Economy in Mexico. They're still hurt from all those comments. But I think, the opportunity's there, and I think they'll eventually have to realize, at least in Mexico, that if they're not together, Mexico and Canada, Trump is going to get more from them. So I'm hoping that we can turn this situation. we saw the beginnings of it with the first Mexico-Canada CEO dialogue a few weeks ago. I think there was some degree of coordination between Prime Minister Trudeau and President Sheinbaum when they were thinking on how to retaliate against U.S. tariffs. It happened at the executive level. I haven't seen that happening at the trade ministry level, and that's something that we need to see more.
Kara?
Yeah, I mean, and I don't really have anything to add except to really encourage people now. I mean, we don't have the tariffs now, so those who are on the fence, it's probably a good time to make a move.
Yeah. So obviously Canada received the 30-day reprieve or stay of execution. But it still seems like there is damage done. I want to shift a bit more to the actual industry and the parts makers and the automakers. And obviously it seems like there's going to be damage done to consumers if you're saying now is a good time to buy as opposed to even waiting a month. So can you just get into a bit more of the damage that might be to general EV adoption from a consumer standpoint?
I mean, yes. The loss of the rebate probably is, in terms of consumer adoption, probably a bigger thing right now. But I will say just about the U.S. is there are still a lot of states with their own ZEV mandates and requirements around EVs that, as far as I can see, don't seem to be going away. And so, I take a wait and see approach on what's going to happen with these tariffs because there's still a lot to happen before they will happen. In terms of the industry, I was talking to somebody who really knows a lot about this, and his view, he does a lot of polling, his view is that a lot of damage has already been done, and that if anybody is going to set up a plant now, who knows what will happen with the plants that are kind of already announced but not started. New plants, and you had to make a choice, I think a lot of people will choose the U.S. And it's super unfortunate because, Canada actually has lower cost for them and great workers and all the infrastructure and great supply chain and everything. But I think that damage probably has already been done.
Yeah, adding to what Kara was saying, I think Mexico and Canada were first on the list, but then I think the EU is going to suffer from tariffs as well. And you can never negotiate and operate a trade agreement if you go on a month-by-month basis. It doesn't make sense. It takes up to 10 years to come up with an idea for a car and then take it all the way to the production line. I don't know if for EVs it takes longer, but if you don't know the rules of the game, if the rules of the game are going to change in 2 weeks, it's going to be very difficult to attract that investment. And if the U.S. keeps pushing on this route, I think, as we were talking in the beginning, the U.S. we're going to change our conception of the U.S. as an unreliable trade partner, and that's when Mexico and Canada should start trading more, and that's where the conversation is going to shift to other markets. And unfortunately, I think the damage has been done, and if we continue on this route, the last thing I would say is the trade agreement, it was a really good tool, but if we keep violating the spirit of the agreement, even with a threat of a tariff, not the tariff itself, that trade agreement is not going to be credible anymore.
You're referring to USMCA?
Yes, CUSMA for my Canadian friends. Yeah.
And maybe I'll just add one more thing in terms of the damage. I think if you look at where Trump version 1 was in 2018 when they imposed the steel and aluminum tariffs, that started 2018. By 2019, Trump had reversed them. And part of what was very important was the integrated network of how everything goes between Canada and US. And I think what ended up happening was the reality and they were losing jobs. So there is, I suppose, a wait and see period, although there's a little bit more of an aggressive point of view on this. I actually am hopeful and optimistic that the future will come to bear quicker. And I'm actually seeing, I would think that, Trump hopefully would remove those tariffs, because I suppose the question would be is what's changed since back then relative? We've become more integrated. The good thing is Canada's also become a bit more resilient in terms of how they're manufacturing and doing, but we are too integrated as a North American practice to be able to separate, right?
Well, so what do you think Trump is really after? It's hard to obviously get in his mind, but like he's done the steel and aluminum tariffs before. They didn't work out.
Yep.
And every parts maker and automaker who's making cars in Canada has basically said like this would grind the industry to a halt within like a week. Like it couldn't even be a day,
Yep,
and they'd
you're
start
correct.
making
Correct.
parts. And on both sides of the border, it's going to hurt American and Canadian consumers. It's going to hurt the industry. So Jason, like, what do you think is really going on here?
So it's tough to get into his mind.
Yeah.
Okay. But with that being said, I think to me what's ending up happening is he's stacking up all these tariffs as bargaining points of views. I think he is going to be going after things like the USMCA. I think he's waiting for those. I think he's looking for additional opportunities where, let's say, Canada and Mexico come to the table with other additional offerings in terms of what we can do to appease and make sure. He has, I mean, just to be clear, I mean, he was voted in a democratic approach. I mean, this is what we were coming. I think what was just unexpected was when he said it, he was going to do it, and that was the reality. So those would be just some of the points of views that I would offer. I think it's the USMCA that he's going to be after, redoing that component. And then, yeah, maybe part of it is when you look at steel, aluminium, what he's trying to do to bring jobs back in. He is a tariff guy. I'm just not sure at the end of the day this is going to play out for the long game. So I don't know.
Diego, you live in Washington, so you bring a bit of a different perspective here.
It's an interesting city to be in. But no, yeah, they are a negotiating tool. But I think his larger point of view this time around is that they're an industrial policy tool to make Mexico and Canada less competitive and less attractive for investment. I think in the not even in the long run, in the medium term, it's going to make the auto industry in the U.S. much less competitive. It's going to raise prices.
Yep.
And I've said this before, but the only way that the U.S. can compete with China in the EV market is if it works together with Mexico and Canada. Canada has the minerals, Mexico has the labor. As we were talking about, we have a joint production platform, and there's no way we can compete with China if we're not together on this.
Kara?
And some of the parts, they cross the border something like 4 or 5 times. I mean, it's just not possible for this to work out. But I saw a really great article in the Globe.
Excellent.
About this is ultimately about water, which it might be. It's hard to know. That maybe the ultimate goal is to get a better access to Canadian freshwater.
Yeah, but just to be clear, if tariffs were to materialize, like we ran the numbers a few weeks ago, and Mexico and Canada were to retaliate, auto exports from Canada and Mexico to the U.S. would decrease from 60 to 90%. The effect would be immediate. And the first ones to suffer that blow would be U.S. consumers. And that has to be out there.
So even if we don't get the tariffs, but there's all this uncertainty, and to your point earlier, Diego, that it's going to make anybody who's setting up a shop is more likely to do it in the U.S. Is this sort of the slow death of the Canadian auto industry? Or because we have received tens of billions of dollars in commitments from automakers to build battery plants and auto shops here. So, Kara, do you want to start?
I mean, I sure hope not. I mean, there are people who are saying that, but I sort of say hold the phone. We don't know if this is just a threat that will, somehow to renegotiate CUSMA or some other thing, and that this one will not be the hill to die on. So, I'm not going to be the first to sort of say this is the beginning of the end. Canada's cheaper and continues actually to get cheaper with our dollar the way it is. So I just can't believe that automakers still won't invest here just because it's much more cost effective. So I think it's pretty hard to say at this point.
Jason?
I think to me the mitigating factor is how integrated our supply chain is. And I know we keep hearing that, but I think what's going to end up happening is the amount of pain that this will cause on the US side. And I think the moment we start to see that, I think there will be some changes in terms of direction. So I don't believe that there would be, while there may be a pause point here and we've got to be thoughtful about investment, I think hold the phone is probably the right answer here, Kara, because people have just got to take a little bit of a wait and see here. There are things that are going to, the way that we've integrated, prevent Trump from getting away from, the issues that he's going to cause in the supply chain by doing this. So to me, I still think it's full steam ahead. We'll kind of see, and I think from a Canada One approach, we've just got to keep on being aggressive that way to kind of drive through.
Diego?
I think I'm in the middle. As I said in the beginning, I think EVs are going to go through a hibernation period. So the dream deferred. It's going to take a few years to get back on track. I think so other technologies like hybrids and plug-in hybrids are going to take the front row while EVs take the back seat. But I mean, I think the regional opportunity is there, and it goes beyond the electoral cycle. So I think if we wait at least until the midterms, we might have a better picture of what's in for the EV sector in Ontario.
I remember in 2016, Trump had just been elected for the first time. Maybe it was 2017. I was at the Detroit Auto Show speaking to an automaker, and he basically said, like, we look at these things in like 8-10 years.
Yeah, you got it.
It's like, even if Trump is in power at this point for 8 years, like, we can't change our thinking. Like, the momentum is all behind EVs.
Right.
So it might slow down some of the things. Might slow down the adoption rate a little bit, but it's not like we're still moving in that direction. Just get back to the industry. Like, what is it going to take for investment to increase back in Canada in our automakers and our parts makers? Is it just like waiting this out for 4 years? Jason, do you want to start?
Yeah, so I wouldn't take such a bleak angle on all of this. I would say if you look at the investments that are currently here, I think part of this is making sure we pony up and be good about, from a government investment perspective, for all of these organizations that have come in. I think if you look at a global look at this as well, where we can actually import and have a look and see what else we can move around the world, not just into the US. I also will continue to say that I think, given that the integrated nature of all of this, there's still a lot of benefits, and what's going to end up happening is that supply chain will break on the other side. And so as that kind of returns, there's still going to be a lot of opportunity. We are cheap, and so that's part of the reason why those tariffs were lifted. The US couldn't compete against us in terms of where we're going, let alone competing against China. So I'm still optimistic and bullish in terms of investments still being looked at here. You can't make, we would be naive to say that what Trump is doing won't draw investment down into the US. But I'm still bullish in terms of the current investments and at least not losing that. We just need stability in the talk track here. This is what the problem is everyone is on a wait and see right now, and no one is going to move into that. So, maybe Kay, your hold the phone component here for the next 30 days, I think, is important. And Trump's already moved it out once. I mean, again, he's had other things in terms of border security, fentanyl. There's a whole lot of other complexities that are making this conversation a little murky, if you will.
And from a USMCA perspective, I think we can still be optimistic. I think Mexico and Canada have demonstrated before that they have successfully managed a volatile U.S. government. We did it back in 2017. We just did it 2 weeks ago. And from a very technical perspective, I think there's still a chance that we can have a conversation about EVs within the USMCA context that's removed from politics, so that we can integrate the EVs within USMCA, and I think many opportunities can come from there. But we need to navigate this the storm first.
Yeah.
That seems optimistic. Jason?
And not to forget, though, that the governors, there's governors in the U.S. that are speaking up now, some Republican governors, against it. And that voice will grow as it becomes more real. And there was a coalition of parts suppliers in the U.S. that have written a letter. Like, we're just starting to see American voices speaking up against it. And I think that's got to go a long way to help.
Jason?
Maybe just one more piece. I think from an industry perspective, again, we got to keep focus on the consumers as well, right? So at the end of the day, at least from our study that we had shown, the intent is still there to buy vehicles generally. You're still seeing a hard push towards EV. And by the time you look at the technology and everything else, I still think consumer demands are going to drive a whole lot of the need ultimately for this. So not bleak in my mind. I think there's still opportunity.
I just have one more question. This is like a big hypothetical, but like, even if the US isolationists sort of get their way and we have these huge tariffs, is it even practical to think that the US can make everything they need for an EV and have it be like in any way affordable to the average American?
So maybe I'll give some conspiracy theories to maybe start. There's a reason why Trump wants us to be the 51st state, right? Part of this is if you actually have a look at our critical minerals, our water, our supply, there's a lot out there that actually needs to be done. If you actually look at the agreements between Canada and US and the critical minerals, there's been a lot of agreements put in place from a national security perspective to ensure that that happens. So at a big macro level, to answer your question from my vantage point, I think the answer is going to be Trump is trying to find wedge points in order to make deals. I still think at the end of the day, we're going to see some of those tariffs kind of maybe dissipate over a period. But it's very evident that what we have in Canada is absolutely needed in the US, and I don't think that the US can do it without us. And I would say the same for Mexico in terms of how those pieces and components go in. But it is because we're very rich in terms of primary resources to actually go out.
Mm-hmm. Diego?
Yeah, and same thing. There's no way you can build a robust, resilient, and competitive EV market in the US without Canada and Mexico. And hoping that in time, some people in Washington, my neighbors, will realize that. Yeah.
Agreed.
Kara, last word to you.
Agreed.
Thank you all very much. Kara, Diego, Jason, this has been really interesting.
Thank you.
All right, my colleague Patrina is up with our next panel.
Jordan. And thank you to our panelists again, Jason, Kara, and Diego. That was fantastic. Now we're going to focus on battery innovations and the future of vehicle powertrains. So to talk about that, we're joined by Charlotte Argue. You can come on stage. She is a Senior Manager of Sustainable Mobility at Geotab. Welcome, Charlotte.
Thanks so much. Great to be here.
Now we have to wave the Canadian flag a bit. Let's start off just by telling us, for the people that aren't familiar with Geotab, tell us about this Canadian company and what you're specifically working on in terms of battery innovations.
Sure, yeah. So Geotab, we are Canadian. We're headquartered in Oakville, so not far from here. But we're a global company, so we have global reach. And we're not directly involved in battery innovation or battery development. What we specialize in is connected vehicle technology. And so, vehicles these days, they're essentially computers on wheels. So there's all these different systems, components on these vehicles. And what we do is we take that data from the vehicles. We take other data such as GPS and camera information and other software, and we translate that data into insights that a fleet operator can leverage to help them better manage their operations. So if we look at fleets today, they're a lot more sophisticated in terms of routing and dispatch and safety and sustainability. And so, the Geotab is a telematics provider, and our primary customer is fleet operations, so on-road vehicles. When it comes to EVs, so EVs today, it's a small but quickly growing portion of the vehicles that we are supporting to date. So we have about 4.5 or so million vehicles that use Geotab. Every year, there's more and more EVs. And our focus with EVs is making sure that the operators have the information they need about the performance, the efficiency. I think I'm supposed to get this amount of range. Am I actually getting that range? How much, what is my current state of charge? How much range do I have left? And then we also are looking at the battery health. So looking at battery capacity and how that's changing over time to give more information to the operator on how their vehicles are performing.
Well, let's talk about the battery health and the battery degradation, because Geotab has an EV battery degradation tool where you've looked at the performance of these batteries in a number of models, a number of makes over the years. What are your findings from that?
Yeah, so this was a really important question, particularly when EVs first came to market. The batteries is the most expensive part of an EV. And so there was a lot of question on how can I expect, am I going to have to replace my battery in 5 years? What is my range going to be like in the future? And so what we did in 2020 is we took a look at real world vehicles that were out there today, because up to date, it was mostly just kind of lab testing, or maybe we had information about lithium ion performance in cell phones, for example. But in vehicles, it was really like we didn't have the data because they weren't there were a lot of vehicles out there. So what we did was, at the time, we looked at over 5,000 vehicles that had been running millions and millions of miles or kilometers, and did an average, like looked at the average degradation rate across those vehicles. So in 2020, the average rate of degradation was 2.3% per year. And then we did another analysis last year to see, okay, well, in 2020, a lot of those vehicles were what we would call kind of the first generation EVs. And so how has that changed? And the more recent analysis we did shows a degradation rate of 1.8% per year. So we've actually seen an improvement in terms of, I mean, it's hard to know exactly what's happening because this is across multiple mixed models, multiple battery chemistries. But what that's telling me is in a pretty short period of time, there's been advancements in terms of battery management, thermal management, battery chemistries that are really helping to protect the longevity of these.
But the cold, the climate that we live in today, how is that affecting the degradation? And
Yeah. So averages only tell us so much. So we do see variability across makes and models and across individual vehicles. When it comes to, so this is an interesting approach to look at because there's different factors that can speed up the rate of degradation. And some are commonly known. So one is, temperature, another is power, so higher power, life cycle, so how much it's essentially utilization. So what we're able to do is, again, we're not in a lab-controlled environment, but what we can do is almost put these vehicles in cohorts. So we can look at vehicles that are operating in really hot climates versus those in mild. And we can look at vehicles who only charge on lower power charging versus those who exclusively use fast charging, for example. And we do see an impact. So when it comes to temperature, what we've seen, the cold doesn't, in terms of longevity, we haven't seen as much impact, but hot climates does have an impact on those cohorts. The other one is fast charging. So those who have high power, high frequency of use of fast charging does seem to have a correlation with faster degradation. But it seems to be the combination of the two that's really the killer. These are things that are important to know because maybe there's ways to buffer against that, or if drivers knew they're operating in a hot climate and they don't need to use fast charging all the time, maybe that information can help them extend the life of their batteries.
And when it comes to the range and the degradation, why is that so important for residual values, for even the cost of these batteries? Because sometimes we've seen that they can cost tens of thousands of dollars to replace a battery on a current vehicle.
Yeah, and right now we're seeing again 1.8% degradation per year. We're seeing these batteries way outlast the warranties from these vehicles. So in reality, it shouldn't really have an impact on the driver or the operator from that perspective. But if their vehicle does happen to have a higher rate of degradation, it's a couple of things. So one is, so I'm coming from a not consumer angle, but a fleet operator angle. And when they figure out, is an EV going to work for me, they're looking at the range needs that they have. And so long-term degradation is essentially you have a certain amount of energy, and over time that amount of energy gets smaller and smaller. So it's equivalent of getting a smaller and smaller battery in your vehicle, which means your total range that you can travel decreases. So that might impact operations. And then the other thing that they think about is the total cost of ownership. And a big part of that is residual value. So what is my vehicle going to be worth at the end of life? And it's a bit of an unknown still with EVs. Some are holding their price or their value better than others. If the battery is degraded significantly, that's going to have an impact on that end of life cost or value as well.
I feel like consumers nowadays, they want the bigger batteries. They want, more range, higher density batteries. You look at the Hummer that has a battery that weighs more than, a Honda Civic.
Yeah.
So what are you learning from the fleet that can be applied to passenger vehicles?
Yeah, it's very tempting to say we need the longest, the farthest, the biggest. I want to be able to power my vehicle in less than 5 minutes. I want my battery to last more than 20 years. Like, it's very tempting to do that. when we actually look at the data, and this came up in the earlier panel on the consumer side as well, but if we look at the data on how fleet vehicles are actually being operated, a large portion of those vehicles could be satisfied by the vehicle technology that we have today. And so I can give you some examples. We looked at over multi-hundred thousand vehicles on the light-duty passenger side, so fleets who are operating cars and light vans. And we analyzed the daily driving data for over the course of a year. And about 3/4 of those vehicles have the range, the daily range needs that can be satisfied today by the EVs that are available on market. And so that tells us, these vehicles, as long as they're, this is the catch, they have to be able to charge when they're not in use, so overnight, for example. But if they're able to do that, it's not, the restriction isn't the range capability of the vehicles. Similarly, on the medium heavy duty side, so think trucks, like delivery trucks and that kind of thing, often we kind of jump to the conclusion that, well, trucks are used 24/7, they're always on the road, they're driving really long distances, but there's actually a large portion of these trucks that have what you would consider local operations. So, for example, last mile delivery or hub and spoke, or going from a port, like a drayage type situation back and forth. And we actually see for those vehicles, their average daily distance is about 100, 150 kilometers per day. And so again, you don't need the biggest battery bank for those applications. And similarly, they are parked for 10 hours, 12 hours in a 24-hour period. So again, they don't necessarily need to charge in 5 minutes. They can probably charge over multiple hours when they're stopped anyway.
I want to talk a little bit about the current state of lithium-ion batteries, and I also want to talk about some of the emerging technology that's coming out, solid-state batteries, sodium ion batteries, and the advantages of them. So,
yeah, there's been a lot of investment and innovation, advancements in batteries, and it's kind of hard to not get swept up by the headlines. You say, oh, this is the next battery breakthrough. Oh my gosh, the world is going to change. And then you don't hear anything for a while. It's like, what's happening? So I think it's helpful to think about, what are we trying to do in terms of these innovations, and what is the advancement that we need? And with batteries and with physics and chemistry, there's no silver bullet when it comes to batteries. So there's a number of things that we're trying to achieve as an industry. So one is increase in energy density. So can I store more energy in the same amount of either weight or size and volume? And that helps us with longer range. The other one is how quickly can that battery chemistry accept or release power? And so that's tied to really, really rapid charging. The other one is safety. So there are certain chemistries that are, have lower risk, for example, to thermal runaway or catching on fire. So that's another one that we're trying to solve for. And again, we as the general industry. Life cycle. So some chemistries last longer. They don't degrade as quickly as others. And then really important is kind of the whole supply chain. So what materials or minerals are my batteries using? Where are they coming from? What is the social and environmental implications of that? How well dispersed are those materials? What countries do they exist in? And that has an implication, many implications, including price, including social and political and environmental. So if you focus on one or two of those areas, there's usually a trade-off in others. And so there's nothing that can kind of maximize that entire list as a whole. So when we hear things like solid state, there's, it could be a transformative change in terms of battery, but in terms of battery density or energy density, but maybe the compromise is price. Maybe the compromise, they are more prone to what's called forming dendrites. And so maybe there's a compromise in longevity of those batteries. With sodium ion. So with sodium ion, you're essentially replacing lithium with sodium. Well, if you look at the supply chain opportunity and the environmental impact and all of that, this could be really, really valuable. Also for price, really, really valuable. But there's a compromise in terms of energy density. So I think what's going to happen is there's likely going to be kind of investments in right fit for the right application. So maybe, for example, if we think of a really heavy duty truck, maybe you want to focus on the energy density and other things, and it's okay for it to be a bit more pricey. Maybe for a consumer car or a commuter car or something that's more urban focused, you're going to prioritize a different kind of set of these components. So I think that's where we're going, but yeah, I'm not going to try to predict when the big breakthrough is going to happen, but I think there's all of these things happening at the same time that are kind of stepwise. And just not to I don't want to overemphasize the chemistries of the battery, because there's a lot happening also in just how the packs are formed. So, the construction of the battery packs and cells, whether or not they're cylindrical versus, a square package, the battery management systems that are essentially monitoring and controlling those packs to, help reduce risk with fires and help buffer against stresses like high power and high temperature. So there's all these other things happening that are helping advance the industry. Yeah.
Okay, I want to talk a little bit about the advancements in recycling of these batteries and second life opportunities for EV batteries as well.
Yeah, I would say, so the recycling and the second life is so important. If EVs are going to be part of sustainable mobility into our future, it needs to be a circular economy. And so when it comes to recycling, a good way to think about batteries, I find, is the actual minerals and the actual metals and components of those batteries aren't being transformed into something else. So you're not combusting it and it's not turning into gas molecules, it's staying there. And so theoretically, the majority of the components in these batteries should be infinitely recyclable, as long as you can pull those out at the end of life, right? And we are seeing great advancement. Like in Canada, we have some world leaders in doing this with lithium ion today, like Li-Cycle and others. And they're able to take those component materials and put it back into the battery supply chain. But I think even before these batteries get recycled, there's, from the perspective of the battery's life in a vehicle, well, when it gets to its end of life in a vehicle, it's not necessarily its end of life in terms of its ability to act as a battery and store energy. And so we're also seeing kind of a new emerging market for energy storage. And so recycling or repurposing these batteries and putting them together in modules to store on site to buffer against when the renewables are producing energy and when we need to draw from it. And so that's another opportunity that's, I think, just beginning to grow.
We only have a few minutes left, and we'll try to squeeze in one more question just about the advancement of these battery technologies. How is it going to change the automotive landscape, and will it help Canada reach its ambitious ZEV targets by 2035, given the fact that we've heard from the last panel, the pricing, no incentives, tariffs, all these other issues coming into play?
Yeah, I mean, right now, as I mentioned, I think a lot of the opportunity, we don't need a massive advancement in the technology or the performance. I think what we need is the price to come down, because that's going to likely make the biggest difference in terms of tipping that scale for that sticker price shock, right? If you can bring that down, plus we already know, as fleets especially, they're saving money once those vehicles are deployed. That's going to tip the scale in terms of increasing demand. And batteries, it's really, really important to get the supply chain there, but batteries are just one part of an ecosystem. So we also need the utilities to make sure that there's local upgrades in the transformers, and the power can get to the vehicles when they need it. We're going to need policies to address other barriers. We're going to need all once the vehicles are deployed, we need that service provider industry to support the maintenance of these vehicles. So I would say batteries isn't the only thing that needs to be looked at. It really has to be looked at as a holistic market and a transformative market as a whole. And there's a lot of different players that need to play their part to get there, I think.
Yeah, it's very collaborative. And even,
Yeah.
the OEMs have their part to play as well. And
Yep. Sure.
well, this is excellent. Unfortunately, we have to leave it there. We're out of time. But Charlotte, thank you so much. That was really interesting. We're going to take a 20-minute break now and then come back here for our next session with Barris and Jordan, talking about how 2025 is shaping up for vehicle buyers. For everyone who is joining us in-house, please join us next door for some refreshments, and we will be back in 20 minutes. Thank you. Thank you, Charlotte.
Welcome back, everyone. I hope everyone had a good break, got to enjoy some snacks. All right, next up, we have a very interesting conversation geared very much towards consumers on the price of cars, including EVs. And we have a fantastic guest today, Barris Akurak, Vice President of Insights and Intelligence at AutoTrader. Thank you, Barris,
Yeah,
for being
thanks
here.
for having me. I appreciate it.
All right. Last year, I loved our conversation,
Yes,
so we invited
that
you
was
back.
fun. That was fun.
We're in a time of supply constraints, skyrocketing prices. We had a very popular article. The headline was basically just the average price of a car is $66,000, I think. So thank you for that data.
Of course.
So what has happened in the past year?
2024 was pretty good. So if you think about the new car side of things, the new car market was pretty strong. Almost double-digit year-over-year increase. Obviously, it differs based on the OEM, but overall sales went up second year in a row. We are still trying to catch up to all these supply chain disruptions and microchip shortages, so there's still quite a bit of pent-up demand on the new side, and new sales were good, and we expect that, again, with the excluding the elephant in the room, we expect that to continue in 2025 as well. And the first month started pretty good. So no big concerns on the new side. When you look at the used side, the story was twofold. The first half and a bit was a bit on the softer side for used vehicles. Cars were more expensive, interest rates were higher. So up until, say, August, September, on a year-over-year basis, sales were down. But with the prices coming down, with the interest rates coming down, we started to see an uptick in sales. And last quarter, Q4 was pretty strong, up by 5.3% is our estimate on a year-over-year basis. And January started off pretty good as well. So again, excluding the elephant in the room, things are going well, and we expect that to continue. But obviously, there's all these volatility in the market, and I'm sure we'll touch upon that soon.
All right, so where we stand now, what is the average price of a new car?
Good. So I'm glad
Yes.
that I brought a cheat sheet because you asked me a lot of data questions. So average price of a new car based on the vehicles that we have, these are listing prices, not transaction prices, $65,317, and it's down by 2.9% on a year-over-year basis. And average price of a used vehicle is just below 37 grand, which is 5.8% decline from the last year January prices. So prices are coming down on a year-over-year basis. Interest rates are coming down, and people are buying them.
So why do you think the prices come down more for used cars compared to new cars?
Yeah, so used car prices went up by quite a bit when the new car shortage was at its peak in 2021. Used car prices went up by 21.7%. And now, when you look at the market, there's quite a bit of availability on the used side. New is also good. So now the market is normalizing, and prices are coming down. So things are normalizing.
What is the average price for an EV in Canada now?
So average price of a used EV is $42,219. And average price of a new EV is $69,039. So, and we don't have new Teslas. As you may know, Tesla is a different business model. They don't advertise on marketplaces. So no Teslas, but the average price is 69 grand.
And has that come down?
Yes, yes, yes. So compared to, again, last year, new EV prices are down by 8.8%. Used EV prices are, ready? 18.4%. So they're coming down quite a bit, and which is good, right? Because one of the things that we keep hearing from consumers is that their range anxiety is always the biggest consumer complaint. The second one is the lack of infrastructure, and the third one is always the higher prices compared to ICE counterparts. So what we did was we found vehicles that have both ICE and EV versions, and we did a like-for-like price analysis. So looking at the new EVs based on January data, EVs are 24% more expensive than their ICE counterparts. And when we looked at used EVs, they're up by 13%. So, I mean, given what we are going through economically, right? So paying 13% or 24% for the same vehicle, and consumers are not happy about that. And price parity needs to be achieved to stimulate demand. But now, right, with all the incentives and all that, so it's very confusing, but it is what it is, I guess.
But even leaving the rebates going away aside, what does that, like, for prices to come down that much for EVs, what does that say about EV demand?
Yeah, EV demand has been, so we do this survey every year in March, and the 2025 version is about to go on the field just now, like in the next week or so. So one of the key questions that we ask consumers is whether they would consider buying an EV as their next purchase. And in 2022, this was 68%. And in 2023, it came down to 56%. And in 2024, it came down to 46%. So overall, the demand has been increasing. But on the other hand, if you want to look from the other side, 46% of the consumers are still interested in buying EVs. So which is not nothing. But on the other hand, this is the demand side. If you think about the supply side, right, we have all these mandates, right? OEMs keep producing, probably my colleagues can attest to this, right? More and more EVs coming to the market. And so supply has been increasing. So based on the vehicles that we have on autotrader.ca, we have around 30% more EVs, new EVs on a year-over-year basis. So what happens when the demand is low and the supply is high? Prices come down. So that's what we're seeing.
When we look at the luxury market in Canada, like it seems like there's a lot of new cars being introduced. What are we seeing in terms of demand on the luxury side and prices?
Yeah, so demand, based on what we see, we've done a bunch of analyses, and what we are seeing is that the demand is shifting from luxury to mainstream brands, which is, again, probably most likely to do with the price differences for obvious reasons. So there's more interest on the mainstream brands and less interest on luxury brands.
All right. Like, we can't not talk about the rebates just suddenly vanishing overnight, it seems. What effect is that going to have on demand?
When I was listening to the first conversation, I was like, I wish I was I was on the fourth seat.
Now's your chance.
I think about this a lot. So obviously it's not good, right? The fact that, now consumers need to pay, in addition to these differences that we talked about, now there's another $5,000 to overcome. So obviously not good, and we know from research that consumers are motivated by incentives, and they expect 30% of consumers we surveyed, they expect $4,000 to $6,000, and 32% expects more than $10,000 when it comes to incentives. So overnight, if you take it away, right, what would happen? I'm not as optimistic as some of the panelists from the first conversation, because I think that EV sales will be more challenging this year, if I may put it this way. So One data point, again, different economies, but now we are part of a global marketplace group, and now we have access to European data. So in Germany, they went through the same thing in December 2023. They removed federal incentives, and sales, EV sales, BEV sales specifically went down by 68.8% on a year-over-year basis. Again, I'm not suggesting that we'll see that kind of a dramatic decline, but I think what I'm saying is we wouldn't be surprised if there's a decline.
In that example, did you see a rebound over time?
From Germany's
Yeah.
perspective, no, not so far. In 2024 was pretty bad in Germany. And we'll see what happens in 2025. But again, they're having some other type of issues. So again, it's not the like for like exact the same economy and situation, but I think it's going to be a difficult year for BEVs. But that said, when we look at so EVs like BEVs and plug-in hybrids and hybrids, so what we are seeing is that there's more and more interest in plug-in hybrids and hybrids. So that segment's going to be probably keep doing well, but the fully electric BEVs might suffer a little bit.
Why do you think people are so interested in the hybrids or the PHEVs? I get this sense that there is probably about half the country could switch to a BEV effortlessly. Like they live in the suburbs, they drive enough, they have a garage, they can charge, or access to home charging. But then there's another half that it's not going to work very well for. They're too rural, they're too urban, they don't have parking. Is that what's really driving the interest? Not above the price?
So price is, again, one thing, lack of infrastructure is the second thing, and the third thing is, as we talked about, the range anxiety. So these are the high-level top concerns. But that said, I think looking at EV sales, just like yes, it's a car, but when you think about it, there's a lot of technology aspect to these things, right? So imagine when there's a new iPhone, right? Who buys it, right? If you think about the technology adoption cycle, right? Early adopters, they go grab them, and then there's the second phase, majority, right? They need to see practicality, right? And right now, based on what we've talked about, and I've heard it from the conversations that we need to build 30,000, what was the figure? 30,000 chargers, we built only 6, right? I think we need 81,000. That's the number that I read somewhere, but we have around 30,000. So we need to do more, right? We need to do more. We cannot just take incentives away just like that willy-nilly, right? Consumers expect that. And to be honest with you, this is my job. I do think about this. I read a lot about this, and I'm confused. So I'm being honest, right? If I'm confused, think about if you're in the market looking for this, you're like, what's going on? Do I have an incentive? Do I have this? Do I have the provincial rebate? How much money do I make? It's just I think there's a lot of unanswered questions, and consumers are confused. So we need to make it a little bit more straightforward, and we can just again, I'm not against mandates per se, but I feel like there's these, 20%, 60%, 100%, but there doesn't seem to be a plan as to how we're going to get to these mandates. It's just a number thrown out there.
So forcing automakers to basically make a set amount of cars, it doesn't necessarily mean that consumers are going to be there to buy the cars at the end of the day.
100%, and we'll keep having these supply and demand mismatch, and there's going to be more and more cars, and the cars are going to get sold. There's going to be more incentives, less profitability for the OEMs and dealerships. On the consumer side, consumers are going to keep getting confused. So this is not rocket science.
So if the automakers are essentially under mandate to make a certain amount of cars to try to sell them, but then they can't sell them because the prices are too high and they're just sitting on the lots, will that mean they're almost forced to bring in incentives and sell the vehicles at a loss?
Yes. Again, I'm not on the OEM side, but that's what we see. You look at the availability of cars on autotrader.ca. When we look at the incentives, there's a direct correlation, right? If there's a lot of something, then there's more discounting on that side, which is not counterintuitive. So, yeah.
I know last year we spoke about inventory.
Yes.
Has it rebounded to pre-pandemic levels?
If you look at it at the aggregate level, we are thereabouts. So if you look at it by OEM, there are still some differences. So for example, European brands, there's a lot of availability right now, and there's a couple of reasons behind it. One, as we've talked about, the demand is slower for the luxury brands that tend to be European. So supply is building up. Number two, when we look at the economy in China, Chinese economy has been struggling in the last while, and there's less interest on European brands, European cars right now. And what we are seeing and hearing is that some of these cars that are not being purchased in China are being allocated to the rest of the world. And three, Chinese automotive market, right? They've been really doing really well and stealing market share. So they have their own economy, less interest in not only European, but in general, any other car company. So these are the high-level reasons as to why we see a lot of availability on the European side. Domestic brands are doing all right. They're still below 2019 levels, but there's like on a per lot basis, we see on average over 100 cars, so there's no issues. But one segment is struggling is the Asian brands. Compared to 2019, they have around 40% less vehicles on the lot on average.
Why do you think that is?
The production hasn't caught up based on the production data we look at. And then secondly, again, demand shifting from luxury to mainstream. Mainstream brands are selling at a faster rate, therefore supply is depleting at a faster rate.
So if supplies has rebounded, I guess the question consumers would want to know is, like, are incentives going to come back? Like, not government rebate incentives, but like just incentives at the automaker. Like, I know I saw from Stellantis has some pretty big discounts, particularly on Jeep.
Yep.
So it seems like their supply is good.
Yeah.
Like, are we going to see incentives across all the OEMs?
We actually do see that data. So we have the access to transactional data, and then when we look at the overall interest rates for new vehicles have been coming down. So I think the peak was around 6.2% in November 2023, and now we are sitting around 4.6% as of January 2025. So it came down a little bit. Probably there's a bit more room to go. And with this volatility in the American down south, right? So we never know what's going to happen, but the expectations is that I think there's going to be a few more Bank of Canada interest rate cuts. And when that happens, we'll see the impact on the interest rates for sure.
We obviously don't know what's going to happen over the next couple of months, but it seems like we could have a new government in Canada.
Yes.
If they come in and scrap the mandates on automakers, what do you think will happen with EV sales?
Yeah, I don't think it's going to help, right? At least on the OEM side, they are still producing cars in order to be able to hit these targets, right? If you remove that, then where's the incentive to buy and sell these cars, right? No incentives for the consumers, less production. I understand that it's not a switch. It's just like let's manufacture more EVs, less EVs. It takes a while, but if you remove them, I think it's going to have a bigger impact on the market for sure.
But if they're making more cars, like in the short term anyways,
Yep.
do you think prices will come down for buyers?
Yeah, definitely. I think as we've talked about, right, there's already almost double-digit declines on a year-over-year basis for used and new EVs. If the mandates are removed, again, production is going to keep continuing for a while, at least until they can rearrange their plans. Again, I'm not an expert in automotive manufacturing, so I wouldn't be too surprised if we see further declines in prices.
Strictly from a consumer standpoint, how can consumers find good discounts on their next cars?
Like, this is an easy one. Visit autotrader.ca. So jokes aside, it's not a joke, but obviously know what you're looking for, know your budget, and understand the market. As I mentioned, if you look at it at the aggregate level, the inventory is back, but there are some nuances at the OEM level. So if you know what you're looking for, if you have the means, and just buy the vehicle as soon as possible, because this volatility and uncertainty, it doesn't seem like it's going to go away anytime soon. So with all the tariff conversations, aluminum, steel, and larger tariffs probably will have an impact on the market. Right now, looking at the availability, we have cars, so the availability is not an issue, but if tariffs come through and if we see prices increasing, then the story might be different. And I'm not talking about only new vehicles, because what we expect to see is that if new car prices go up as expected because of these tariffs, we expect to see that the demand's going to shift from new to used, just like what we saw during COVID, during the peak inventory shortage times. So, and again, I'm reiterating the same message, but used car prices went up by 21.7% in 2021. So that happens, again, used car prices are going to start to go up, and both new and used will be up. So if you have the financial means, I suggest you pull the trigger if you can find the vehicle that you're looking for.
When you look at all these numbers, what surprises you the most?
Well, nothing surprises me anymore, because I wake up and I'm like, let's see what's the flavor of the day is today. So no, I think look, the market, jokes aside, the automotive market has been pretty resilient. We've gone through some crazy stuff in the last 4 or 5 years, right? Inventory shortages, microchip shortages, prices went up, prices came down, the EV mandates, incentives, like tariffs now, right? Like everything, like just throw it to the market and then we figure it out. So I'm not really surprised per se about anything anymore. But what I want to see is that, like, for the next couple of years, can we just have a normal couple of years? And just seriously, everything's now normalizing. Prices are coming down, interest rates are coming down. There's cars out there to be bought, right? Like, it's normalizing. So now we have to deal with this. So all I want to see for the next couple of years is that can we just do some business and buy some cars and drive some cars and enjoy our lives?
Although I feel like that would make your job less interesting.
Yeah, yes. This gives me a little bit of employment insurance, sure, but let's not get into that.
I can't forecast the future, obviously, but I think the simple answer to your question is no. That it's not going to be a straightforward
No,
market.
Probably 2025 is going to be a little interesting. Another 3 years and 11 months to go, I guess. And then we'll see what happens after.
I feel like we're on a pretty stable ride for, I don't know, whatever number of decades. And it seems like really since the pandemic hit, prices, sales, inventory, everything has just been on this roller coaster, and we can't keep up.
Yes, and I'll be very open and transparent. So before COVID, not much changed, right? Prices didn't change much. Inventory was there. Consumer demand was there. Yes, there was a little bit of up and downs, but normal as expected. And we didn't know much about the market as much as we do now. So now that things are upside down, we have a much better understanding because of all this turmoil. But yeah, it's definitely interesting, but I want some normality for a couple of years. I really do.
On that note, we're out of time. Unfortunately, we have to leave it there.
Awesome.
But thank you very much.
Of course. Thank you.
Thanks, Jordan, and thanks, Barris. You are a wealth of knowledge. And now we're going to focus our discussion on the risks and opportunities on the road ahead for Canada's auto industry with our next panel and our last panel of the day, Automotive Outlook, Actions for a Thriving Industry. Please welcome our esteemed panelists to the stage, starting with Brian Kingston. He's the president and CEO of the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association, which represents Canada's leading manufacturers of motor vehicles, including Ford, GM, and Stellantis. Next, we have Yvette Zhang, who is coming in from New York. She's the Advanced Mobility Segment Co-Leader and Partner in Automotive and Industrial Practice at Alex Partners, a global management consulting firm. And last but not least, we have Matthew Wilson. He's the Senior VP of the Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters, Canada's largest trade and industry association. Welcome, everyone. I do want to mention before we actually get started into the discussion, we will have about 10 minutes at the end of the session for your questions. So if you have one virtually, you can add it to the chat box. If you have one in the studio, you can just raise your hand and one of our ambassadors will come over with a microphone to ask the question. But let's jump right into the discussion. And Yvette, I want to start off with you because there are certainly a lot of challenges and disruptions facing Canada's auto industry. And Alex Partners just did a disruption index survey. Can you tell us a little bit about that survey and what you found in terms of the major threats affecting Canada's industry?
Yeah, more than happy to. Thanks for having me here. This year is the 6th annual Alex Partners Disruption Index, which we surveyed more than 3,200 CEOs and executives across 10 industries, including 300 executives in the automotive industry along the value chain, and also across 11 countries, which Canada is one of them, and we surveyed more than 300 people here as well. The big news is really, I want to make sure I cited the numbers right. The big news is that automotive emerged as the most disrupted industry this year for the first time in the last 6 years. And even it's more disrupted than the famously volatile industries such as media and entertainment, telecommunications, and consumer products. Or more specifically, 4 in 10 OEMs, suppliers, and dealers, and over 50% of auto services and shared mobility executives expect significant disruptions in the year ahead. And if we talk about Canada specifically, 60% of the Canadian automotive executives thinks their companies has been highly disrupted in the last year compared to 48% in the US. So it's more disruption we see here. And if we talk about some of the concerns, let me give maybe a few examples here. More than half of the OEMs and the suppliers internationally believe that disruptive forces will keenly impact supply chains and operations. And if we look at Canada here, 60% of the Canadian automotive executives expect their operations to see more changes in the next 12 months. Other disruption or other concerns include data privacy, cybersecurity, interest rates, and governmental elections, right? We see that both like in North America. Among the Canadian automotive executives specifically, regulations and taxations, right? I think that would be the key, like really the hottest topic we're talking about today. So 70% of the Canadian automotive executives will really worry about it. There are really a lot of the data I can share, so feel free to reach out to me, and I would love to share more findings from our study.
Okay, well, let's expand on some of the things that you mentioned. Brian, I wanted to talk to you about Canada-U.S. relations and talking about, Trump slapping us with 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel yesterday after our so-called reprieve. What does this mean for Canada's auto industry, for the supply chain, and for consumers when it comes to buying cars?
Sure.
It's a loaded question.
Well, first I'll just say I can confirm the data. I'm feeling very disrupted so far this year, and frankly, it has been quite a roller coaster ride for the past few years. But yeah, the proposed tariffs, and we saw comments last night from President Trump suggesting now a 50% tariff on Canadian vehicles, maybe even 100%, because we have stolen the industry, according to his remarks. So tariffs of those magnitude are catastrophic. The industry is completely integrated. It was founded on integration, and that goes right back to the 60s when we had the Auto Pact, which created this environment where you could have an intercontinental supply chain. And as a result now, North America is responsible for about 17% of global automotive production. So we've had very intentional, thoughtful policies designed to create this. If you put in place a tariff on parts or finished vehicles, it disrupts that supply chain. So immediate impacts, production losses, job losses, price increases, not just in Canada,
in the United States as well. The best example of what this could look like is the Ambassador Bridge blockade. Not exactly the same, but a key trade conduit stopped, and within days you have plants in the US that can't get components and parts. If you have a tariff of this size, the margins in this industry are too slim. You can't just eat that cost, so you have to find another supplier, and in many cases that's not easy to do quickly, or prices go up. So these are the impacts that we'd be seeing if tariffs go forward, and that would be sort of the near-term impacts. Long-term impacts, of course, we're in this struggle with China. The industry's competing to win the race to electrification, and if North America is fighting amongst itself, who's going to win? Definitely won't be North America. It will be the Chinese manufacturers. So, yeah, I'm happy to get into details on all of that, but that's kind of high level. That's where the immediate impacts will be if these tariffs go forward.
And Matthew, where do you think is Ontario well positioned, given the fact that we're so tied to the U.S.?
So, what a ray of sunshine being up here with these two. Let me tell you. So I will try to bring a bit of and the optimism stems from maybe some of the earlier comments, and the investments, the massive investments that we've seen in Ontario's auto assembly sector, both in terms of the tier one big parts supplier. We saw Linamar just in Guelph, my hometown, just a couple weeks ago, even post the tariff announcement, made a $1 billion investment there in EV technologies. We've seen pretty much all the major OEMs make major investments over the last 3 or 4 years, and that gives me reason to believe that we are well positioned to weather this. So there's been a lot of commentary about you have to wait 2 years or 3 years or 3 years, 11 months for other panelists, and I think we can collectively weather this because, as Brian just said, it's in our collective best interest. This isn't a Canadian versus US or versus Mexico story. This is how do we compete against the rest of the world, and I think eventually, just like Trump won, that message eventually did get through. So I think Ontario, if you look at where we are from a manufacturing assembly perspective, given the most recent investments, I think we're actually in a pretty good shape to weather some of those storms, unless companies start pulling out dramatically, which tends not to be the way they act. And then if you think about the further supply chain, we are so uniquely positioned here in this province. If you look at the critical minerals we have in Northern Ontario, in the area where I grew up originally, massive opportunity to develop that and the economic benefits that come with that, which is, I think, a lot of what Trump's looking to get at anyways. So huge potential there if we actually can get our act together and develop it. Great technology sector, great post-secondary education sector, very, very deeply integrated supply chain. We've got everything in this province that every other jurisdiction in the world dreamt that they have. So it's why the auto sector is here. It's why they're as strong as they are, and it's why I actually believe that we've got a, it's going to be probably a long 5 years this year, but it's going to be, I think, once we get through some of the honeymoon phase of Trump 2 here, I think we are in a good shape to move forward if we can get industry and government working together. And I think we'll get into that a little bit later on. And I'd argue that the problem actually here is that our industry and government have not worked together very well for a very long time, and it's left us exposed.
Yvette, how can we minimize, the risks around these tariffs? Mm-hmm. What are some short and long-term goals that we can set to kind of deal with them? Yeah, sure. Happy to share that. We've been working with auto OEM suppliers all over the world, and there are just still a lot of uncertainty here, so things can change from time to time. But a few, I would say, non-regret actions include, for example, looking into the really low tariff sourcing locations, right? And really, it's by item for both finished goods and components. Secondly, we could look into the rapid actions, looking at other costs, because it's not only just about sourcing, right? So try to look into the operations and commercial activity, etc., to try to optimize the cost structure as well. And lastly, maybe a lot of the OEMs and suppliers didn't want to do that, but there's also another vehicle we can use is look into the pricing, doing some really detailed analysis on the price sensitivity, right? So there is another way really to transfer the costs. But there are really
case by case, right, depending on the different situations. So we work with really we work with clients across the borders to optimize supply chain management. And we have our own methodology, our own tools, such as Global Trade Optimizer that looking really globally, looking to the best options here. So happy to discuss that further as well, if anyone's interested.
And Brian, a little bit earlier, we talked about some of the challenges facing EVs and the China market. Can you talk about that as well as another one of the major challenges facing Canada?
Sure. So the Chinese market and the investment that's gone into this space, this goes all the way back to 2015 with the Made in China. It was an industrial strategy that clearly identified dominating globally in the EV space, and I think it's probably safe to say at the time, maybe it was dismissed, perhaps, the intensity of that plan. And what we saw was about $233 billion US in direct subsidization of the Chinese EV sector from that period to today. So as a result now, by the end of this decade, China will have capacity to satisfy 80% of global EV demand, 80% from one single country. So that's what we're up against, and we saw the United States recognize this both from an economic, industrial strategy perspective, but also from a national security connected vehicle perspective, and put forward 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs. Canada has followed suit and has put that in place as well, and is also now investigating the national security risks around connected vehicles. So that is fully underway. Obviously, part of doing those policies in Canada was to align ourselves with the Americans on the understanding that we're going to work together to take this on. And now, of course, we're dealing with this U.S. situation. So I still remain optimistic. I mean, to your point, I think we'll come through this, and there is a recognition that we have to compete as a North American region. But that's what we're confronted with right now in the broader EV market.
And Yvette, what can we learn? I mean, obviously, China has a competitive edge over everybody else. What can Canadians learn from them?
Yeah, I know that we will not avoid talking about China, right, when we talk about disruption. We've studied that a lot as well. So some data I can quote is since 2023, Chinese brands alone continued to dominate of their home market. And we forecasted that they will reach 72% of the home market by the end of this decade, I think, in addition to what you talk about even the globally. But also one more thing I want to highlight is the price wars in China that were really fierce. That has driven out a lot of OEMs out of the market, but also they have created really strong survivors in the market, not only just in China, but also ready to disrupt the whole world, right? So there are a few learnings I'd like to share here from those really survivors here. For example, really looking to the product development process, because the OEMs, really the NEV OEMs in China, they're really agile, including decoupling hardware, software, using a lot of the virtual testing. So that leads into 18 to 24 months of the launch time, compared to like about 3.5 years in the Chinese legacy OEMs, also maybe up to 5 years with the really Western traditional OEMs, right? That's something we can look into. Another thing I want to highlight is very sophisticated supply chain management, which is connected to the tariff question as well. For example, to involve the suppliers early in the stage and really use the standard modules, investing into the upstream of the value chain, including those advanced technologies in materials, so that they can get closer, right, to the technology and materials. Dual sourcing, which is already quite frequent used vehicles here, and also using the supplier funding of engineering and tooling really to mitigate the risks here. So again, a lot of different vehicles that maybe we can use customized into different situations. But yes, there are. If we look at the bright side, there are a lot of lessons we can learn from the competitors for sure.
And when it comes to actually, building EVs and manufacturing them, Matthew, I mean, Canada has every critical mineral needed, water, everything. How can we play our cards right to make sure that we can really seize that moment to develop the manufacturing process?
It's going to be interesting. I think I think the last couple of weeks have been a real wake-up call for Canadians. And you look out there. I've spent 25 years, more than 25 years of my career promoting, advocating strongly for domestic manufacturing. Helped launch a brand here in Ontario called Ontario Made years ago during COVID to celebrate locally manufactured goods, including cars that are made locally. Never seen the attention from, or even the interest, I would say, from governments like we've seen the last couple of weeks. Certainly consumer demand, we've seen a quadrupling of interest on things like our Support Ontario Made website that we run. The demand is there and the attention is there from politicians and governments that we've never had before. And so when Brian talks about, China, the Chinese industrial strategy, I've spent 25 years trying to convince governments in Canada that we need an industrial strategy, whether it's for auto or for minerals or whatever, and largely gets ignored. They never really saw it as critically important because they were complacent, frankly. Just like we are from a security perspective. We look at the US, we see them as our ally and someone we can trust in. And so we have these well-integrated supply chains that work really well, where our security's tied in, we holiday down there, we're best friends, whatever, and then you get the shock to the system that we had. And I think if you look at some of the political actors in Canada today and what they're saying, including our premier here and the opposition leaders going through the election, and what you see in Ottawa with our prime minister and the opposition leaders, I think there is now finally a recognition that it's not good enough anymore that we just rely on someone else, that it's time that we take control of our own future. And that gives me, as someone who's advocated for this for a long time, it's not this whole sentiment we need to decouple from the US is absolutely idiotic discussion, by the way. But there's a lot more we can do as a Canadian society to build our domestic industries up, right from the ground, right through to selling stuff. We're really, really bad at commercialization and scale in this country. So I'm really hopeful, actually, that the shock that we've seen the last couple of weeks will actually drive us to serious discussions about industrial policy. How do we get energy to market better? How do we leverage our resources better here? And then how do we develop better products that the world needs and we can export to the world at the same time as leveraging the relationships we have with the USA and Mexico and Europe and others. So there's a lot we can do here if our governments actually work with industry, as I mentioned before, and there's a lot we can sure talk about on that. But that's been the missing piece for a long time. I think industry's always wanted to do it. Didn't really feel we had a partner in government, and I think now that there is that partner, the governments are very serious now about how do we actually develop Canadian resources and our technology and our know-how to do a lot more with it than we have in the past. So that's part of the reason why I'm optimistic about it.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more, and we're so reactive generally in Canadian policy-making circles. If you think back to the $46 billion in new automotive investment that has been announced in Canada since 2020. What was the trigger for most of that? Was it a long-term, thoughtful strategy to attract automotive investment to Canada? No. It was the Inflation Reduction Act, which suddenly terrified Canada and Canadians because we realized that the Biden administration was putting forward incentives at a level we have never seen before, which tilted the playing field aggressively in favor of the United States. And full credit to Premier Ford and the Prime Minister. They recognized the threat and they came forward with a package to make Canada competitive. And there we are, we won this investment. But was it something that we had been planning and had this thoughtful strategy behind? No, it was a reaction. So that tends to be how we've sort of behaved here in Canada. And just to your point on, if there is one area where we actually do have a natural competitive advantage, it is in minerals. We've been talking about it forever. Only nation in the Western Hemisphere with every mineral for EV batteries. We should have been focusing on ways to permit mines, build the infrastructure. It's 12 to 15 years for a mining permit. Instead, the federal government's been trying to find new and unique ways to regulate the automotive industry for the past 8 years, quite successfully making us uncompetitive when they could have been finding ways to approve mines and build up our supply chain, focus on those upstream activities. So we've just kind of missed the boat on it, and now it's very, very much because of the threat from the United States, everybody's getting getting in motion, and I hope we don't waste this, I won't call it an opportunity, but let's make the most of this and actually make ourselves indispensable to not just the US, but the rest of the world.
And we will likely see a new prime minister coming into power, different philosophy. Matthew, does that mean we will see maybe less red tape and less regulatory requirements when it comes to?
I'm not going to make election predictions of Globe and Mail. Have lots of people around here that can do that kind of stuff. I've certainly been right before, but also been wrong before. Well, all we do know, there will be a new prime minister, right? Could be any stripe, we don't know at all. I would say that regardless, though, of what stripe they are, that the imperative need to make fundamental changes in the way we manage our economy and work towards economic development is essential. And I don't, whether it's Chrystia Freeland or Mark Carney or whoever might win the Liberal leadership, whether it's Jagmeet Singh, Pierre Poilievre, it doesn't really matter, frankly. I know we're a completely agnostic organization. We tell Premier Ford in Ontario the same thing we tell Justin Trudeau in Ottawa. I'm sure Brian's organization is no different. And so it doesn't matter who's in power. There needs to be a rethink of the way we do things. The mining permit's a really good example. 15 years if you're lucky. I think Brian was being really optimistic when he said that. It's basically how long can we delay before until you go away. And that's just not good enough. But that's the headline grabbing stuff. The stuff that no one sees, it's Ford or Toyota wanting to build an expansion on their plant in Southern Ontario and going to a regional government and asking for permits and it taking 2.5-3 years to get permission. We know of members who literally just wanted to build an expansion on a plant. It was about $200 million expansion, employ 100 new people, and it took 2.5 years. So they just built a whole new factory in South Carolina. And that's the type of stuff that doesn't get headline attention, but that drives companies absolutely crazy. And that's the stuff we need to look at as Canadians, whether it's in Ottawa or here at a local level. We need to do better on regulations, and we need to make it easier to allow companies to invest and employ Canadians. And right now, it's very, very hard to make those investment decisions in Canada.
Brian?
Sure. I mean, look, don't get me started on EV mandates. Just to give, there's been a lot of talk recently about interprovincial trade barriers, and it's kind of the topic that comes up every few years. But when I look at the auto industry and some of the things that make it challenging to do business here, we've got multiple levels of government that all have different roles in environmental regulations or regulations that impact the industry. That are all trying to achieve the same outcome, but are working in completely opposite directions. So the best example is you've got an EV mandate in BC, you've got one in Quebec, you've got a federal EV mandate, and that's on top of existing extremely stringent emission standards. This is just insane regulation, and the amount of time, energy, resources that get spent on trying to manage these regulations from a company perspective is time, energy, and resources that could be spent on other more productive undertakings. So we have a problem in this country. We just don't seriously try and make ourselves competitive, and it does get noticed, and it will impact us, particularly in an environment where we have trade barriers and tariffs. If we don't get serious about this sort of thing, our competitiveness as a nation is dramatically weakening.
This idea of mandates, it's been brought up a few times, and Brian can talk about, but much better from an industry perspective. Just from a pure, manufacturing and also a consumer choice perspective, someone who drives an EV actually, I think mandates are ridiculous. How do you tell? I grew up in Northern Ontario, where my parents live. There's one 50 kilowatt per hour charger within a 2-hour drive of them. One. How are they possibly? And my dad doesn't have a smartphone, so talk a lot about infrastructure. I took my EV out on the East Coast on a trip a couple summers ago. Got it, fantastic drive, amazing drive. No real problem with charging. Always could plan it out. The apps are fantastic. You get to a charging station though, and then it's a guessing game as to which app's going to work where. And there's no pay at the pump, right? Like it is with a car. And so you get somewhere, and I actually ran into this guy. I was at a Petro-Canada charging station, which worked one day and didn't work the next day. I needed to use it. And I got there, and after about an hour and a half of starting and stopping the same charging station, I finally got what I needed to move on to the next charging station. It was fine. We had a meal. It was all good. But this gentleman comes up behind me. He had just got his brand new EV, and he was taking his wife for a road trip. And he pulled up next to me, and he was waiting for me to finish. And he said, "How do I use this?" And I'm like, "Oh boy," right? Because there's nothing for 200 kilometers around there. And I said, "Well, you need a smartphone," and he pulls out a flip phone. So you better just go in and talk to someone. And it's like what do you do, right? And so it's this idea of mandates and forcing consumers into a certain lifestyle that, frankly, if you live downtown Toronto, we're sitting here, I'm looking at all these condos, there's nowhere to charge. So for certain people in certain situations, and I think, someone said earlier, 80% of Canadians could probably use an EV, or 50, I've heard different numbers say. 100%. I think the more people use them, the more people actually, I'm an ambassador for them with my friends, and I've had friends buy them because I bought one. Absolutely love it. It's a fantastic technology. But I would never in good conscience tell my parents to buy one, right? It's just not, it's not practical for them. So this whole idea of trying to force something on consumers in a short-term mandate, never mind what the manufacturers are actually technically able to do, the market's not going to support it. And so I think there needs to be a lot more conversation here about consumer choice in this. I know something Brian and CVMA spend a lot of time on to make it more realistic for what Canadian consumers are actually able to do, in addition to what can actually be brought to the market in the right time, or else you're going to see these massive disparities between prices and supply and demand that is not going to be good for anyone at all, right? So it's a weird situation that I think our governments have put us in as consumers, but also just from representing a manufacturing perspective, it's a really, really weird scenario, because what government's trying to do does not line up to reality in most cases.
No. Well, and it will foster a pushback, and that's been our concern from the get-go, is that if you mandate consumer behavior, eventually you'll have a place where gas-powered vehicle inventory is restricted because of the mandate. There will be a consumer blowback on it, and that to me is very worrisome. And we just have to build the supports out, right? You may have noticed I arrived just in time. I drove from Ottawa in my EV, and I do this drive all the time, but in the winter, and these are things that people don't talk about enough, but it's just the reality. It took me 6 hours door to door. The drive is usually 4 hours in a gas car. Because 2 chargers were not working, one in Kingston, one in Napanee, and then the third one that I stopped at was posted 150 kilowatts and it was putting out 40. So, and that's common. I do this drive constantly, and it's taking me about between 6 and sometimes 8 hours in the winter. So it's just not, I'm willing to do this because I love the technology. I want to be an ambassador for the technology, but if we don't get those supports right, most, you could survey this room. I'm sure most people would say, I'm not going to be satisfied with a 7 or 6 hour drive to Ottawa. It's not realistic. So this is the challenge we have. Let's focus on the supports. People will move to the technology when everything 100%. Is in place.
Well, we have a couple of minutes. Let's talk about some of the opportunities that lie ahead, so we're not in this bleak environment the entire time. Yvette, do you want to share some of the opportunities for supply chain optimization and economic growth, job creation?
Yeah, I would love to, because I think maybe I start off kind of throwing numbers only on the challenge side, right? But our AlixPartners Disruption Index also identifies some of the exciting opportunities as well. So if I can quote, for sure, people know about the AV, ADAS, software-defined vehicles, AI, machine learning, etc. Those are seen as the top opportunities. 70% of the executives really see the technology disruption as an opportunity, and a lot of them actually see AI as a method to further grow the revenue side, not only just at the cost side, but the top line as well. And another interesting finding here is 69% of automotive executives really believe merger and acquisitions, as well as the vertical integration right now, is a great opportunity and critical to combating the disruption. So it is really, they are expecting and pursuing the transformative M&A opportunities in the next 12 months. So those are some of the very exciting opportunities ahead of us.
Well, you mentioned mergers. I mean, Brian, talk of Nissan merging with Honda and Mitsubishi. Will we see more of these moving forward? How is Ford and Stellantis?
I won't comment on any member mergers, but look, it's a highly disruptive time in the sector, as we noted from the outset, and that your data is just fascinating, that it's the most disrupted sector right now. And there's just so much money being spent. I mean, the figures grow constantly, but the most recent assessment is around $1.2 trillion by automakers into electrification through the end of this decade. If you look at here in North America, it's about $288 billion US has been announced in new investments since 2020 into the North American region. Overwhelming majority, 80% of that into the United States. this is a lot of capital that is being deployed by auto companies as this transition occurs. And it's like any technology transition, it's not clear who will be victorious and who will be the first to unlock. I think for a lot of consumers, particularly in North America, having a vehicle that has an extremely long range for that first jump into electrification at a price point that is seen as kind of feasible for your average household, that will be the winner. And so we don't know where that's all going to land, but this is why you're seeing moves towards mergers, acquisitions, JVs, partnerships on battery, because everybody is trying to sort out, how do they remain highly competitive in this very transformative space. So yes, I think you will see more mergers, acquisitions in the coming years, and it's just because of the highly disruptive period that we're in right now.
Are you, Matthew, seeing like investment, like less investments in Ontario because of these threats?
Again, we've seen some very recent investments, big investments. I think typically companies, auto or otherwise, it doesn't matter what sector you're in, if there's disruptions, if there's uncertainty, companies don't invest. We're no different than ourselves, right? If you're unsure whether you have a job next week, you're not going to go out and buy a new car, right? You're going to sit on it and wait. So I think the uncertainty will cause a pause, but it's not just a pause here. It's going to be a pause globally. I would believe anyways, because that disruption we're talking about isn't just a Canadian disruption. I think it's a global disruption that's going to take place. And so I think it'll put a chill on investment, just generally speaking. But I think it's why it's so important that our governments get back to work and work with industry on creating those right conditions for investments. When investments are ready to flow, we need to be at the front of the line. And the reality is, if you look at data, we talk about all the data in the world, but one of the things that we talk about at CME is we are dead last within the OECD and dead last within the G7 in investment in capital stock. So our manufacturers, and the auto sector is actually the one exception up to it to a degree because of how advanced it is, but generally speaking, manufacturing in this country is way, way, way behind our global peers. And as a result, we invest less in technology, we're far less productive, which leaves us exposed to threats like the US. And as a result, actually, we are less prosperous as individual Canadians, Ontarians. We need to see investment. It drives GDP growth. It drives wealth creation in the country. And so our governments need to start focusing on these things and be ready for that investment that will come. And mergers and acquisitions, that always gets wrapped up in investment numbers. Not really that helpful, just to a growth perspective. May help streamline things and make companies more productive or whatever, generally speaking, but it doesn't grow the economy because it's like a foreign company or a Canadian company buying another one. It's not increasing the capital stock or the productivity overall. So we need to see new investment in new capital stocks, new plants, battery plants and other plants. And Canada is typically ranked dead last in the OECD and G7. We have been for about a decade now. So we need to see a change in that for sure if we're going to be prosperous as a country and be able to withstand the threats that we're under right now.
Well, I want to open up to questions from the floor because we have about 10 minutes or so. Milo, we have a virtual question that we'll start things off with.
We have a couple of virtual questions first, and then we'll go to the in-person audience.
Sure.
First question.
A little bit louder.
Oh.
We can hear you now.
Is the Canadian auto industry tenable in the long term given increased density and alternative mobility practices?
Get you to repeat that once more?
Yeah, absolutely. Is the Canadian auto industry tenable in the long term given increased density and alternative mobility practices?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Yes.
Long term.
Long term, yes. And a few reasons, but first of all, it's just the nature, the geographic nature of our country. We've got 1.1 million kilometers of two-lane public road. Not many countries have a road network of that size. So people will continue to want personal vehicles, need personal vehicles to live their lives in this country. So even with changing mobility opportunities, public transit, the perennial discussion in this country about high-speed rail, maybe we will get that, and that will have an impact on some of the highway congestion. And of course, density downtowns with subways and so on. But it will not change the fact that we're a very large country and people do drive long distances and will want personal mobility options. So I'm confident in the long-term automotive industry in this country.
And we have an in-studio question from Kara. Go ahead.
Thank you. Interesting discussion. Thank you. I wanted to ask a question about mandates, which I feel like there's a bit of a misunderstanding of what the mandate is, because it's not a mandate on consumers. It's a mandate that the dealers make these vehicles available. And the reason for the mandate was because we couldn't get the vehicles, and there were many dealers with no EVs on the lot, and actually that reduced consumer choice. So the mandate goal is actually to increase consumer choice by making sure dealers have the vehicles on the lot. So if what I'm hearing is correct, that you don't like mandates, what's the alternative to make sure that Canadians have a choice to choose an EV, and not saying that they must, but that they could? How will we attract those vehicles here? We all know Canada's a pretty small market in the scheme of the world.
My favorite question. I had a feeling you'd ask it. So yeah, the mandate does apply to the auto manufacturer, that who is regulated, but the effect is on the consumer. Because the way it works is that a manufacturer has to sell an increasing ratio of EVs, and the only way to make that equation work, if the demand isn't there, as we're seeing right now, the demand is not there to support these mandates. Quebec's a great example. They have to double EV sales in the next 3 years. It's not going to happen. There's just no consumer demand for that level of EV penetration. So then what will happen is the manufacturer has to start pulling back gas-powered inventory, restricting consumer choice. So it is borne by the consumer, because if you go to a lot and you live in Quebec and in the next 2 years you go to buy a car and you can't go EV because, let's say, you live in a rural area, you live in a condo with no charging, whatever the reason may be, you may go and say, I need a gas-powered vehicle because it's the only type of car that will work for my life, and the manufacturer, the dealer, will have no ability to sell you that car because they have to balance the ratio that the government has mandated. That is a very bad outcome, and that's how you get a huge populist pushback to this technology if people feel like their choices are being restricted. To your point around the purpose, yes, the purpose of mandates originally was when there were no EVs in market. So we had 3 EVs in 2012, there's 130 now. The problem has been solved. The mandates need to go because they're just a regulation from another era. Inventories are now at levels, we had the discussion previously. A lot of dealers are sitting on too much inventory now. They can't move the vehicles, particularly with the incentives that have gone away. So supply, inventory model, it's all been solved. The mandate has got to go, or it's going to cause very serious market problems in the coming years.
And we have another virtual question from Milo.
What incentives can governments give for plug-in hybrids that encourage both OEMs to build factories to make them and consumers to buy the plug-in hybrids?
Well, I'll take it again.
You're popular.
I think the most effective incentive we saw on this was the federal purchase incentive program, which did apply to plug-in hybrids. And we have a plug-in hybrid built right here in Canada, the Chrysler Pacifica, which I was driving previously. Great vehicle. So I think you need consumer incentives that help push people into it. I do find that a lot of people that are hesitant about going fully electric, the plug-in hybrid is a great option, particularly with some of them that are coming out now. I mean, they used to have, it'd be like 20 kilometers of plug-in range. Now, 50, 60, 70 kilometers of range, you can drive. I mean, there were times where I'd be driving the van a whole month without the engine kicking on. So the technology's come a long way, but the incentives do help in these early days in the transition. I'd also like to see more incentives for home charging installation. We've seen some of that. But even something as simple as a tax credit, it goes a long way. And a charger, once you have that, it is a game changer for your vehicle and for your driving lifestyle. So I'd love to see some more supports there. And some manufacturers are doing it on their own. I mean, Ford just announced a program in Canada where they're helping people with chargers and charger installation.
And we have another in-studio question.
So I have a plug-in hybrid Pacifica, so I definitely understand
There we go.
I actually EV, but that's a different conversation. I was more curious around if you see manufacturing alliances, given that most manufacturers are global. Like Stellantis is a great example, where they have a huge European division. Do you see, similar to the way we've built a lot of cars here for the American market, that on the flip side, we could build a lot for the European market, given our position to that market as well, and essentially replace some of the American demand with, like, in an ideal world, small European EVs? Do you think that's a possibility in our current landscape?
Not really. There's a lot of talk right now about, how, and what do we do to reduce our dependence on the U.S.? And I think you can look at that in some sectors. That's an opportunity. Really tough in auto. The whole industry has been founded on this north-south integration, and it's just extremely hard to diversify away. Even though we have a free trade agreement with Europe, we've got the Trans-Pacific Partnership. There are accessible markets, but it just doesn't make sense as a manufacturer to base here if you're going to service Europe. You're better off to be in Europe. And same thing in some of the Asian markets. So when it comes to auto, we are heavily dependent on the U.S. market. And that's not, I don't see that changing anytime soon. I don't know if you.
But we're dependent on each other, right, Brian? Well, let's go back to where we started from.
Yeah.
We're so interdependent that trying to break that off. And the other thing is what's different between, this is going back to my days at CVMA, so I know this stuff, Brian. But the difference between the European and North American markets are massive, right? And they're massive because of the size of land that we occupy. They tend not to drive, except for, the Autobahn and stuff like that, tend not to drive fast, long distances like we do here on the 400 series highways or whatever, or the interstate system in the United States. Creates very different vehicle dynamics. So small, compact cars aren't as much in demand. You've seen that in the past where, Mercedes brought the smart car here, sold a handful of them. Like they did not last very long in the market because the demand isn't here from a consumer perspective because of the driving dynamics typically the Canadians face or North Americans face versus what you see in Europe. So the ability to build those here for a local market's pretty limited. So you're not going to build them for a foreign market if you can't really sell them here either. So you tend to build cars for your local market and then export the excess to foreign markets where it makes sense. And there are some models that actually do get made here. I think Honda and Toyota, for example, make some stuff here that go over to Europe. I remember one time being at an announcement with the Prime Minister where after the CETA deal was made with Europe, where Honda was going to be making right-hand drive vehicles to send to the UK, for example. So some of that does take place, but it's not a primary focus. They build local, right? And these companies are global scale. Typically, there's very few local scale companies. They're global scale. They build globally, and they build in the local markets they're going to serve across the supply chain. So Toyota has plants in Asia and Europe, South America, North America. They're not going to start sending 100,000 vehicles from Canada to Europe. I couldn't imagine, anyways. Just what I know from them.
Yeah, 80% of sales are in the pickup truck and SUV category in Canada. It's just, and that's one of the challenges we have with electrification. Big batteries, and hence the cost is higher for those vehicles right now.
And we have one more quick question that we'll get to here in the audience.
It kind of works on the segue off of his. So, Brian, at Blackbird's Talk Auto, you talked about the manufacturing in Canada. And we sell about 1.8 million cars, give or take 1.5 million this year. But we only manufacture about 1.5. And going back to your comment about the auto pack, and that used to be the one-to-one in and out. Do you see, with potential threats of tariffs, things like that, some retooling for in-market where you're seeing that 1.5 much more geared towards the Canadian buyer? Or vice versa, the cars we're making here are going to get basically shoved onto dealers' lots from there?
Well, it's a good question. I hope we don't go down that path, but that is one potential outcome. I mean, if the U.S. is going to pursue this isolationist, protectionist policy, the Canadian government has already said that they would retaliate on this by putting tariffs on American manufactured vehicles coming into Canada. U.S. manufactured vehicles had 40% of registrations last year. We're the biggest export destination for U.S. motor vehicles in the world by far. 25 billion US in exports. That's more than Germany, China, Mexico combined. So if we go down this road of decoupling, then what you could see is almost a return to sort of auto pact style where we have highly protectionist economies and you're requiring, this is sort of like things have been operating in Brazil for a long time. If you want to sell in market, you have to manufacture there. So you could see a world in which that becomes how we operate, but very bad. Like this is so bad for competitiveness, for productivity. I mean, the costs that would be incurred by manufacturers and then consumers would be astronomical. So it's a terrible outcome, but it does, given the way the sort of U.S. trade policy appears to be heading, it is one potential pathway that we may end up having to explore. I hope not, but it's definitely there.
Well, unfortunately, we have to leave it there. Thank you very much. This has been a great discussion. Brian, Yvette, Matthew, very much enjoyed this discussion that we've had. I also want to take a moment to thank our sponsor, Toyota Canada, as well as all of our panelists and our moderator, Jordan, today, who helped us as well. And of course, our audience who is here in-house and at home. The questions are phenomenal as usual. We will be sending out a survey because we want to hear your feedback so we can make these better. The virtual audience will receive a QR code now that they can complete the survey, and you will get a link to this broadcast in about 2 weeks. So thank you very much for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your day. For our in-house audience, we will have a networking reception next door, so please join us there. Thank you again, everyone.